Theorize and be damned.
Hey all, welcome to another episode of Theorize and Be Damned, where we tend to explore the writing process rather than just the theories behind the books we're talking about. So this is a podcast of Revol Press. You can now see on our screen share 3 offerings from Revol Press, the publisher that was set up by myself and Dan Malo, who's here with us.
Hi.
And we have, hi Dan, we have The Darkest Timeline coming from Bram Gieben. I always get his name wrong, it's Gieben, I believe. We have a book coming from me, Hungry Ghost in the Machine, on addiction, digital capitalism, and the search for self. And a book coming from Adam Turl called Gothic Futurism, Art and the Working Class. And actually we have a book also, a brilliant book coming from Tony Chamas, aka One Dime, who a lot of you will know, but we're still working on the cover there. But we hope to reveal that within days, if not a couple of weeks. So that's what we're doing. We're dedicated to an author-centered kind of approach, which means we have a lot of conversations with the authors about what they're trying to achieve. We give pretty good royalties. So follow us, look at our website, www.revolpress.com, subscribe to our Patreon, and we're really looking forward to reader feedback when Bram's book comes out in June. But moving on from us, we're here with Matt McManus, who is a teacher at the University of Michigan. We say adjunct professor, I guess. And he's written an awful lot of books. I'm going to mention 3 of them. The Political Right and Equality, which we're looking at here, which we'll talk about in this episode, The Rise of Post-Modern Conservatism, and A How-To Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism. Sorry, I'll say it again. A How-To Guide to Cosmopolitan Socialism, which was a tribute of a kind to Michael Brooks. And I mean, many other books that he's edited and authored and co-authored. So we're going to dive straight in there with this question that people find terribly painful and ask Matt, why do you write?
Well, I guess there are 3 core reasons why I write quite a bit. Certainly, I've been told I write quite a bit, so I'll just take everyone's word for that. The big reason initially was financial, right? Just to be completely crude and economistic about it. I mean, back in 2018, when I got my first academic job at Tec de Monterrey in Mexico City, especially during the summertime, we didn't make enough to make ends meet. So writing helped with that, right? A couple $100 here and there might not seem like too much, but you stitch a few writing projects together, it can actually make a pretty meaningful difference. So I started doing it for that reason and just never really got out of the habit. I think the second main reason was, genuinely speaking, I think the world is in a worse place now than it was even 10 years ago. Not to say it was perfect, but certainly post-Trump, post-Orban, post-Ukraine invasion, post-Gaza, we can say things have taken a downturn. And I want to make a small difference to try to nudge political opinion in the right direction. Whether I've done that or not, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. And I guess the third reason is I had a really good high school teacher in literary arts. Her name then was Margie Barkley, but she taught me a lot about how to write consistently and taught me different techniques about how to be prolific, how to organize writing like a job, that kind of thing. And a lot of that just stuck with me. So I guess those are the 3 big reasons.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's impressive from a writer's point of view because, yeah, as we've said, you're prolific. And there was a tweet recently, somebody said, like, just how do you write so much? And I think you responded like, you always find that, I don't know what you said exactly, but a kind of somehow a funny question, or maybe it's not that easy to answer. Maybe there's some kind of feeling of modesty, and but you do write a lot. This is quite clear.
Thanks.
To me, and it's always of a high quality. I suppose writers want to know how do you do it, because we all have book projects and we want to write them, but things often get in the way. So the question often is like, how do you do it around your other obligations, which in your case is teaching, and many of us listening will know the teaching workload is a considerable one.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you plan around your your teaching?
Well, the best book I've ever read on writing is, appropriate enough, a book by Stephen King called On Writing. Not one of his better titles, right? But King points out that people, and I think this is true on left and right, tend to glamorize the process of writing. Whenever you see somebody writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction in a movie, there's usually this big spark of inspiration, and they get down and you see them frantically typing on a keyboard or writing something in a notebook, or nowadays writing something on a laptop. And what King points out is, obviously inspiration is important, right? If you don't have inspiration, it's going to be pretty hard to write anything. But if you want to be a writer, you kind of have to start to treat it like a job, or in my case, a part-time job. And what he means by that is, you have to set some time aside every single day and try to commit yourself to whatever writing project you're engaged in. In his case, what he says is he writes for 4 hours a day and reads for 4 hours a day. Now, for 99% of us with a day job, that's going to be just completely impossible, right? Also tells you why Stephen King can punch out like a 1,000-page novel every year, right? But what I'll try to do most days, especially at the end of the day, is commit an hour, maybe 2 hours to reading, and then an hour, maybe 2 hours to writing after I get back from teaching, and to stick with that 5 days of the week at the very least. Now, there's some variability in that, fucking when exams are due and essays are due, that all tends to fall to the wayside, because in between marking and responding to emails, there's just no time for that. But I think that most people, if they want to write, if they do something like that, they'll be surprised at how prolific they can be. Just treat it like a job.
I hear you. Yeah, that sounds pretty. That sounds pretty good advice. I suppose that's just where I find anything like that difficult. Anything where I have to commit to doing it daily, or several days a week, say certain times or something. I pretty soon give that up. So that would be like jogging, reading, X many paragraphs from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. At some point, I kind of go, yeah, I can't do this. Well, I don't say that exactly. I just stop doing it. I just get out of the routine. Something will interfere. And so one day I won't follow through the routine, and then it goes to shit, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I still finish, these long books I'm reading. I still finish writing, but I can't do it in any methodical way. But I suppose that's probably the case with a fair few people. But yeah, being able to do that is a big bonus if you can do that, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And look, you know what they say, if you love something, don't make it your job, because you'll very quickly learn to not like it. And I think there's some truth to that, right? I got into writing in part, like I said, because of financial necessity. And I'm not gonna lie, there were some days where I really resented having to do it, because I would do my day job and I'd come back and I was like, I just really want to crack open a beer and relax. And instead I got to write this 200 or 2,000 word review or whatever it happens to be for X, Y, or Z thing. But I do think that King is right. The hard reality is, if you want to tackle writing either as a part-time career or as a full-time career, you do kind of have to approach it like it's going to be a job. Because I've known a lot of people who will sit there and say, I'll only write when I feel really inspired to do so. And I very rarely found that kind of attitude produces much of anything, since if you work all day and you have kids and you're doing all that, unsurprisingly, people don't feel particularly inspired to put pen to paper at the end of the day. You really have to kind of push yourself to do that.
I'm curious, Matt, like, to take a little bit of a step back from all of this. The constraint piece has always been of interest to me, and I guess I'm curious for you, if the limitations on time were not as severe as they were under our current political economy, what kind of time would you ideally dedicate to reading and writing and engaging with content that way?
Sorry, can you clarify? I'm not quite sure I understand.
So basically, like, if you didn't have to work a day job for capitalism, what would this still look the same for you? Would writing be different? Would reading be different? Engaging with the content be different?
Oh, 100%. If I didn't have to work a day job for capitalism, I'd probably dedicate myself full time to writing, since I like teaching, right? And actually, I do think that teaching is undervalued as a source of inspiration for academic writing, since I tend to agree with Richard Feynman that if you can teach a subject matter to undergraduates, you'll probably come away with a pretty good understanding of that subject matter. And that translates, I think, into writing indirectly, right? Since when you learn how to communicate with an undergraduate audience orally through something like a presentation, you can translate those skills or transfer those skills into trying to write clearly for more general audiences or even for academic audiences, right? But I do think at this point, if I didn't have to teach 3 or 4 classes a semester, I probably just dedicate myself full time to writing my books. And, doing all the normal shit that comes with that, presenting, going to book launches, doing things like this, that kind of stuff. Say la vie, though.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking also, I mean, if you're teaching a lot, you're writing a lot. I'm not seeing how does anything else fit in? I mean, I have no idea what you do with your life. I've seen a couple of pictures when you're like, I'm just chilling now, watching. Is it watching the American football or the baseball? Something you were getting into?
Oh, is that the NFL draft? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I don't understand so well these American sports. You're in fact Canadian, but
yep.
But in any case, I mean, do you find time for all the other stuff? Do you get to do sports? Because we often think about well-being, which is a big kind of area, is a very important area, because obviously if you work too hard, you suffer in terms of stress. One suffers in terms of stress, and it's often said that this is a real problem in a capitalist society. So how do you kind of factor in well-being? Because you seem out of a lot of the theorists present online, often the online left, shall we say, you seem fairly well, but of course I don't know you in person. Can you just say some words on that?
Well, I mean, I'm very lucky to have a supportive wife and a supportive family network and a lot of good friends, right? That's really key, I'd say. One of the things that I've come to appreciate as I've gotten older is Hegel, Marx, and Aristotle's lesson that a huge amount of our well-being is dependent upon those around us, right? This kind of atomistically individualist idea that we are all responsible for ourselves is really an abstraction. In terms of, what I do to kind of chill out, I guess, I'd say there's like 2 or 3 things, right? I go to the gym a couple days a week. That always helps, right, to decompress. Although I do sometimes listen to podcasts. In fact, I usually listen to podcasts when I'm at the gym, so it kind of doubles as a work thing. I like to cook. Cooking relaxes me, oddly enough. And I suppose I'll rope into that. I enjoy making cocktails. Sometimes people have seen the fruits of my labors on that online. And I should say that that's kind of those 2 hobbies don't necessarily pair well together, because I'll go to the gym and then I'll come back and I'll make a cocktail and some kind of an extravagant meal, right? Probably be better if I just decided to cut one of those out. But I guess other than that, I just spend a lot of time with friends and family whenever I can. I'm going back to Canada for a couple of weeks in June after I presented CPSA, and I'm going to hang out with some buddies and listen to music. That's what I do.
Okay, so yeah, well, that sounds good. I mean, yeah, there's always that kind of dialectic between the gym and eating and drinking. But then if you do the gym, then you can you're allowed to do that. So just thinking, getting onto the book. So you've written this book, The Political Right and Equality, out from Routledge. Did it come out last year? Wasn't it summer 2023?
Yeah. It was around July, August was our release, and it did pretty well. So I'm happy about that. It's gotten some positive reviews, including from some conservatives, which I didn't expect. But they did the whole at least you took our work seriously kind of thing. And it sold well. So I'm happy with how things turned out with that.
I mean, like many of your books, it's kind of like, it's a kind of insight into this crazy right-wing world. I mean, you're really among, again, the figures of the online left. You seem to be the one really going in there. You're reading the trashy books like American Marxism, Race Marxism, all of these awful takes on the left, quite extremist takes, and the kind of, actually you could even say more sensible ones like Jordan Peterson, because Peterson actually seems kind of fairly together in comparison to some of these other figures of the right.
Man, maybe once upon a time.
Together in his writing, fairly together in his writing, although I don't agree with a lot of it. Completely untogether in his online persona now.
Yep.
I mean, really, just I just can't help but feel sorry for the guy. I actually did tweet this the other day, and I think you reacted to it. But yeah, I mean, people take it that the left hate Peterson. I get some kickback on my Instagram. I'm much more active on Instagram than Twitter. But if I make a meme and there's Peterson there, you'll get some people like, why does the left hate Peterson so much? But I don't really hate him. I just see it as kind of tragic, that he was, he had some okay things to say, and now he's got barely anything reasonable to say, and he's become a kind of weird parody of himself. And it seems that he's been really messed up by the demands of publishing in the kind of digital capitalist era, that he's constantly saying something on Twitter, podcasting, appearing on podcasts, and it's that need to keep putting something out, which means he's often putting out complete nonsense. And because he's taken steps towards extremes, then got bigger audiences, he's having to then kind of outdo himself. And yeah, it's like watching a car crash in a way, because he really just sounds perverse now, the way he talks. And he's always doing he's got a kind of bizarre voice, and then he's got a kind of comedic high-pitched voice he does when he's impersonating the things that the left say. But he's kind of slipped into using the comedic parody voice nearly half the time he's talking, or it's coming in a lot anyway. The point is, these people were kind of perverse, and you spend a lot of time with them, in terms of headspace. So I wonder, how you kind of deal with that. But where was the actual quote I wanted to pull out from the I think it might have been from the acknowledgement section even, or you say, oh yeah, I can confidently say Albert Hirschman was right in saying a lot of conservative rage is very amusing and very short on substance. And of course that is true. Was that you speaking? Yeah, because it was in the acknowledgement section, so it's you, because there's another, I think there's an intro maybe by someone else.
By Ron Miner, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the thing. It's all kind of funny, but then also it's kind of deadly serious. So, I mean, how do you kind of bring those two elements together?
Well, I've written a few different books on the political right, including co-authoring one on Jordan Peterson, and then writing my work on postmodernity. And there is no doubt that a lot of right-wing discourse is enormously funny. Especially when they complain about, how our culture has become saturated by this victim mentality, and yet they seem to present themselves as the biggest victims of them all. Although there are some important reasons for this, and I mean, there's really no other way to see somebody like Charlie Kirk wearing diapers to a college campus to mock college victim culture than as almost self-parodying, right? But the point of this book, The Political Right and Equality, was to observe that while there is without a doubt a very amusing, shrill component to conservatism and to the political right, there's a more serious side to it as well. There's intellectual genealogy that goes back to Aristotle through people like Robert Filmer, and that includes important authors like Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, Michael Oakeshott. And so what I wanted to do in this book was something different than what I did in the postmodernism book, by talking about these more serious intellectuals and breaking down what I thought were the core arguments that they put forward for reactionary positions, and then illustrating why I thought, even while some of them are stronger than others, ultimately one should still adopt a progressive kind of mindset. So this book is not a complete genealogy of the intellectual right, because it would then have to be, 3,000 pages, and people would still complain that there were major authors that were missing. This is just my kind of crack at talking about some of the representative authors from a left-wing perspective, and I hope that the book would be interesting to people who are engaged in looking at the substance of right-wing views, rather than just kind of denouncing the Charlie Kirk and lobster tuxedo wearing Jordan Peterson types of the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's something presumably there. I mean, people have these opinions which are contrary to ours, so we ought to try and see where they're coming from. Although something really kind of stood out early on in the book, and you basically said that there have been advances in terms of, you know, equality, in terms of you know, providing opportunities for all. Of course, it's never all, but you know, we kind of roll out, you know, education and opportunity more and more. You know, evidently there's more opportunity than there was for people in the West. So you know, socialists and liberals are aiming at that, but the political right is not. I'm actually paraphrasing very much, but the point you make is, well, actually, the right wing doesn't want equality. It specifically doesn't want equality. And I think that's very important to remember, that there may be reasons why people maybe want to feel special. They get off on kind of elitism. They like the competition. Maybe they don't want to feel that they are working class. There's this issue of being kind of like temporarily embarrassed middle class people. You know, there's this kind of culture of aspiration. So, I mean, the thing is, it's like so many of these people buying into this basically unequal society don't stand to benefit from that at all. And this is a problem going back a long way. And I don't actually even know how far this goes back. But let's say that Thatcher really benefited from the working class vote.
Oh yeah,
you know, and that was people who, you know, given the opportunity, do you want to have potentially a council house, or do you want to buy the old council housing stock? Then people were like, you know, I'd rather buy the old council housing stock, you know, the old state housing stock, to have my own kind of piece of England, as it were, or piece of Britain. How do you see that unfolding now? Is that mentality getting more ingrained, and how can that be maybe challenged?
Sure. Well, I think before I dive into the practical instantiations of this, it'd probably be useful to talk a bit about the main thesis of the book, which, as you point out, is that the political right is committed to this idea of inequality. Now, people don't have to take my word from this. Actually, the main theoretical impetus for this thesis was two authors, one of whom, of course, is a left-wing author, Corey Robin, author of The Reactionary Mind, which everyone should check out. It's a magnificent book. But the other major author was Friedrich Hayek, who I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with. Hayek wrote a very good essay and a very knowledgeable essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative. And in this essay, Hayek says that the essence of conservatism, or the political right generally, is this feeling that there are, and I quote, recognizably superior people in society. And these recognizably superior people are entitled to more, very basically, right? More status, more wealth, more power, more affluence, more golden toilets if you're somebody like Donald Trump. And that this is not only natural, but beneficent. Beneficent potentially even for everybody, because the conservative impulse is that if a society does not acknowledge the recognizably superior persons, then it is going to be deficient or even decay in certain kinds of fundamental ways. And there are just innumerable examples of this that I point to throughout the book. Many conservative authors are actually extraordinarily pointed in this observation. I'll just give one very quickly. So James Fitzjames Stevens, who some of your listeners might be familiar with in the United Kingdom, was a famous critic of John Stuart Mill, wrote a response to Mill's liberal socialism called Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity. And Stevens said that the problem with all of these progressives, whether they're liberals or socialists or feminists, is their conviction that equality is a good thing. I tell you instead, and this is Fitzjames Stevens talking, that society is held together by people who are willing to obey, as it calls it, a real superior. And he goes on and says, to obey a real superior is a great virtue, maybe even the foundational political virtue, because unless people are willing to obey their superiors, there won't be society, because society is predicated on obedience to superiors, right? Hopefully real superiors. So that's the kind of main thesis of the book, right? And I think that it's sometimes hard for progressives to wrap our heads around this commitment to inequality, precisely because most people go into progressive politics precisely because they see a commitment to equality as just axiomatically good. And there are deep cultural reasons for this that many people on the political right have probed in in some detail, right? People like Nietzsche or Dostoyevsky, for example. We can get into that later on. Now, in terms of how the political right tries to popularize this commitment to inequality, that in itself is a fascinating story that I don't dedicate as much time to in the book as I probably should, quite frankly. But initially, at least, the political right is on the back foot, starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, because it's not able to make a popular pitch for its positions. If you think about somebody like Edmund Burke or Joseph de Maistre writing at the fall of the ancien regimes, they are unstinting in characterizing the masses as, to use Burke's term, the swinish multitude who have forgotten their place and feel that they are entitled to the same kind of political rights as kings, queens, and aristocrats. And people like Burke have no patience for anything like that, right? Or, take Joseph de Maistre, right? Joseph de Maistre famously said that the hangman or the executioner is the real founder or the real glue of civil society because he instills a proper awe on the part of the masses for their betters and for their superiors. But very quickly, conservatives realize that this isn't working all that well, right? If you start to characterize most people as the so-called swinish multitude, they aren't exactly inclined to be supportive of your political program. And so it's really extraordinary as conservatives start to find very effective ways of trying to give ordinary people a taste of what it means to be an elite and to suggest that this taste is going to be taken away if they allow progressive movements or radical movements too much latitude. And a couple of examples that I bring up in the book are, let's take the American South as a quick example. In the American South, many slaveholders were deeply concerned about the rise of abolitionist movements in the 19th century, understandably, right, since it really threatened their class position and the source of their economic affluence. And they realized that one of the reasons abolitionism was gaining traction was precisely that many on the white working class in the South didn't feel any particular compulsion to defend the privileges of slave owners. If anything, they saw them as kind of hoity-toity and removed. And so what you saw was slave owners and their defenders, people like John Townsend, the senator, start to write pamphlets saying, look, if you are white working class in the South, you might not own slaves, but you are still part of an aristocracy. And they weren't afraid to use those terms because even if you are white working class in the South prior to the Civil War, you still, are able to sit at the master's table. He will listen to you. He will call you sir. You are able to participate in politics in ways that the slaves aren't. And you always have somebody available to wipe your boots when you need to be able to look down upon them, right? And this, of course, was an extraordinarily successful PR campaign, if you want, because literally millions of white working class Southerners decided that they were willing to fight and die to maintain the privileges of the slaveholders, precisely because they didn't want to see this system of racialized hierarchy disappear, since then they would now be on the bottom of the racial hierarchy with the people that they had long disdained. Or just again, to give another example, think about what's going on with the demands for feminist agitation that have been occurring for about 200 years now. The American revolutionary John Adams, at the outset of the American Revolution, had a famous exchange with his wife, Abigail Adams. And Abigail Adams said, look, all the arguments that you can make against the British monarchical system, women could make against men because we are essentially dominated by you. Our natural rights are not respected. And so when you establish this new revolutionary society that you seem so insistent upon that you're willing to drag the country to war to achieve it, you should, to use her term, remember the ladies. And Adams said, no, we're absolutely not going to take women's demands for equality seriously because that would subject all men, as he put it, to the despotism of the petticoat, since it would give women too much power and now we would have to listen to them and we're not willing to do that, right? And these kinds of ideas, of course, proved enormously attractive to many American men who would otherwise fight and die to try to achieve liberal rights for themselves, but saw no inconsistency in denying that to women. Because while they were marginalized in one respect, they were elites in another respect in the home. So the political right is very adept at finding these kinds of elitist cleavages in society and exploiting them to militate against groups that demand for a more comprehensive form of equality. and you should never underestimate their capacity to achieve a kind of populist base through these kinds of appeals.
Yeah, I do wonder sometimes about the anti-intellectualism that you talk about, and the way that's used to maintain and kind of potentially contribute further to hierarchy. I mean, I just wonder how much that is. That's kind of that's a ruse. That's something that Trump, for example, doesn't think. He doesn't think the intellectuals, are the problem, as he's telling the public, or kind of encouraging the public to be anti-intellectual, because intellectualism is a form of elitism. He's saying that. Yet, of course, he's the elite. So there's this kind of scapegoating, which is very common. So they're always pointing to somebody else. But also, Trump surely does fear intellectuals.
Oh yes.
To what degree is this, spinning a story and saying, well, it's the intellectuals, that's your problem, and that leads the public to become, more anti-intellectual than they are, and then to become more stupid and then more malleable. To what degree is it that, and to what degree is it just the actual fear of intellectuals on the part of the right-wing elite?
Well, I think this is a very complicated question, and conservatives have an ambivalent relationship, or the political right generally has an ambivalent relationship to intellectuals. On the one hand, certainly post the French Revolution, they've recognized the need to have a kind of intellectual cohort of their own to be able to militate against the very powerful intellectual arguments of liberals and, of course, socialists and Marxists, right? And sometimes they're very overt about the need not only to support that kind of intellectual cohort, but to create it if it doesn't exist. So people like William F. Buckley, for example, were very overt about the need for a kind of cadre of conservative intellectuals in the 1950s, since they thought that post-New Deal and post the Second World War, the left, or at least liberal leftists, were just mopping the floor with the political right. But as you point out, generally speaking, there is a kind of pronounced anti-intellectual tenor to a lot of right-wing thought across the spectrum, right, from fascists to modern conservatives. And there's good reasons why they adopt this kind of anti-intellectual position. So I'll give just a few examples of this. One of the core reasons why conservatives are concerned with the impact of intellectuals is what they really want is a passive society, at least on the part of the lower orders, where people know their place, accept it, and they don't criticize the established order too much. And conservatives, consequently, will often blame left-wing and liberal intellectuals for riling up the general population, and they resent them for that. And again, you don't have to take my word for this, right? The brilliant, and I mean that sincerely, conservative theoretician Roger Scruton, in his classic book, The Meaning of Conservatism, once wrote a paean to what he called unthinking people, where he said, there's something really admirable about unthinking people who know their place, who don't look for political solutions to their problems, and to the extent that they suffer, they try to resolve that individually, rather than making it everyone else's business. And this respect for unthinking people is not coincidental, right? It's baked into this conservative desire to have a relatively passive population that's not going to politicize and demand change. But there are deeper roots than this still. Think about somebody like Edmund Burke or Joseph de Maistre, just to go again to the founding of the modern conservative tradition. Edmund Burke was notably one of the first conservatives to suggest that the reason for the French Revolution wasn't the actual suffering that was endured by the French population or any major structural problems with the Ancien regime. He acknowledged that there were some problems with the Ancien regime, but the main reason, he said, for the revolution was the agitation of these nefarious, mostly Jewish, from his perspective, intellectuals, right? Who he said are spreading this all-conquering empire of light and reason that wants to take away all the pleasing illusions that make subordination easier. And these pleasing illusions are not something that he wants stripped away. He's very overt that if you take away the pleasing illusions that glue society together, what people are going to conclude is that a king is just a man, a queen is just a woman, and we have no reason to obey just any old man or any old woman. These illusions are necessary in order to keep the chains of subordination intact. And this all-conquering empire of latent reason destroys them. And Joseph de Maistre was even more overt about this. When he was talking about the French Revolution, he said, reason is fundamentally a destructive force. Okay. And he used that term overtly, destructive. And he said the reason why reason is a destructive force is it encourages every baker, every butcher, every barber to think that they are entitled to be a critic of the regime that they lived in, to assume that they have a right to decide what kind of politics that they want to see instantiated, to take issue with their position in society, and of course to chastise their betters by suggesting that things should be done differently. De Maistre said, political questions should not be subjected to critical reason, certainly on the part of the lower orders. Instead, political questions have to be taken as settled and treated, in his terms, as dogmas, right? You commit yourself to the order you live in as a matter of faith, and you treat it with a kind of religious reverence. And he said, if you don't adopt this kind of mindset and you allow everyone to become a critic, you shouldn't be surprised when you get revolutions, because then every person without a penny to their name decides that they are entitled to have an opinion on society, and they do not want that. And again, you can still see plenty of instances of this today. Think about like the kind of furor that's taking place about things like critical race theory or race Marxism, all the kind of stuff that you're talking about. It's very much an echo of this resentment of people being critical thinkers and this desire for them to return to being passive sheep-like subordinates again.
Yeah, that is a contradiction. I mean, you can kind of see a Nietzschean impulse if you take Nietzsche to be the elitist that he certainly is, you know, in many passages of his text. But then, you know, the public position themselves as like, you know, they're all for this Nietzscheanism, this kind of striving, this kind of individualist striving, and you know, they at the same time consign themselves to being the kind of slave class. So they're like, yeah, we're all for this, but then take everything from us to, you know, to prevent, you know, communism, socialism instead, to prevent socialism, communism taking away our kind of vitalist outlook, you know, a kind of outlook of that is basically based almost on instinct. So they go from like, you know, wanting to be the elite to actually consigning themselves to never having that opportunity. And that's a really kind of unusual kind of process. You talk about that a bit, and you talk about, you kind of go from Dostoyevsky to Nietzsche, and you know, there's a lot of stuff going on there. I did follow it, but I only know Dostoevsky's Idiot and Notes from the Underground. But basically, so Dostoevsky starts off as a leftist, and then he has various experiences, and you kind of discuss, you know, his overview of you know, leftist groups at the kind of activist level, and how there's a lot of perverse behavior in these groups, and you know, a lot of intent to take power within the leftist group. So you have these leftist groups which are against hierarchy, but there are hierarchies that emerge inevitably within those spaces, and I've seen this myself. So it was kind of funny reading your account and then Dostoevsky's account, you know, of these kind of unusual contradictory behaviors that emerge in leftist groups. And Dostoevsky sees this, and he has other kind of personal experiences which lead him away from the left, and then what he really resents is modernity as such, and the nihilizing impact modernity has on the individual and the community. And so he turns to a kind of more spiritual account. And then you get onto this, basically he jettisons reason for kind of a common kind of human spiritual core. I see that happening really a lot. I see that happening a lot in the kind of growth of online spirituality, in kind of following crystals, in numerology, and you know, there are other kind of counter rationality counter Enlightenment processes that are playing out globally. But anyway, you go through that with Dostoevsky, and then you
You're
get
only
to
being a bit cantankerous right now because your chakras are out of line, though. Like if your chakras were in line, then you'd be a lot more benign about these things.
Yeah. But then you get on to and I follow this quite a lot actually. It's the theme of one of the main themes of my next book, Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, is that kind of problem. But I want to get to then how you then go into Nietzsche, and then you go into Nietzsche is like the only continuous critic in the Enlightenment tradition. So there's this Dostoevsky that kind of jettisons the Enlightenment, but actually is it kind of building up to Nietzsche? This is how I'm interpreting your kind of timeline. Is it building up to Nietzsche as the only true kind of rationalist figure that will shake everything to its core to get, to get past the kind of fluffy thinking that re-emerges into Enlightenment? As rationality can be seen as having a strong Judeo-Christian underpinning. So, in a way, it's only the right wing that's really challenging the tendency of the Enlightenment to kind of run from itself, that we had this Enlightenment, and it's like, well, okay, we need to kind of stop being whatever we are, in the sense that we are highly rational beings with a strong tendency towards archetypal imagery and storytelling and belief. So we kind of we develop science to get away from that, but then science kind of turns in on itself, and we end up with politics, liberal politics, as a kind of wishful thinking. So you kind of get to, well, Dostoevsky or Nietzsche via Dostoevsky is like the only radical Enlightenment thinker. So is that right, what you're saying there? And then what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I call Nietzsche a radical Enlightenment thinker in his mature period. Without a doubt, he is sympathetic to it in his middle period, so-called, right? On the more general point about Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, the reason why they are the kind of focus in the book that they are is that I think that they are really the twin apexes of right-wing thought. And I don't think anybody would deny that, right? And in them, you find the most distilled, profound, and revelatory instantiations of the core convictions that make up the political right. The same way I would say that you find the most profound, systematic, and remarkable kind of insights into what it means to be on the political left in the writings of people like Tolstoy and Marx. To use, another Russian and then German thinker, just kind of add some symmetry there. But Dostoevsky, right, is a very probing critic of the left in a way that somebody like, say, Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro could only ever aspire to be. And the reason, as you point out, that Dostoevsky is such a potent critic of the left is he started out on the left, right? He was part of a variety of different radical circles that were kind of burgeoning in Russia at the time, that were committed to liberalism, science, materialism, socialism, anarchism, right? Familiar with all of them and shared a lot of those convictions. Now, the reason for his transition towards a kind of conservative Russian nationalism and Russian orthodoxy are very complicated because, to put it mildly, Dostoevsky was psychologically a very complicated guy. I mean, just read his novels, right? But long story short, right, the usual tale told about this is he was arrested by the Tsarist government along with his colleagues, or comrades, really, sentenced to death. There was a gun aimed at his head, and then his sentence was commuted to hard labor in Siberia. Now, you might think this would have the tendency of radicalizing Dostoevsky further, but what ended up happening is he went to prison in Siberia, and he spent a lot of time with convicts, mainly from the working class, and he realized that he had very little in common with any of them, right? Most of them just saw him as a kind of nebbish, progressive intellectual from the middle class who had really no experience with the hard lot that had been allocated to them. So that was one thing that he realized. The second thing that he realized was that a lot of people from the working class were pretty shitty people, right? That's why they were in jail, not just for political reasons, but because they had murdered and raped and stolen all these terrible things, and this dissuaded him from this romanticization of the working class that you see in early Dostoevsky novels, like Poor Folk, for example, which is almost a kind of Dickensian tale of what it's like to be poor in urban Russia in the mid 19th century. It's a remarkable novel, by the way. People should read it if they get a chance. So he came away from this recommitted, if you want, to a kind of Russian Christian orthodoxy, and wary of the kind of radical politics that he was committed to before. And later on, this germinated into a much more full-throated psychological and philosophical critique of progressivism that you see in the course, particularly of his 4 great novels. Now, I'm not going to go into enormous detail about all of this because we'd be here all day, right? But I think that Dostoevsky launches 3 critiques of the left in his novels. One is just satirical, pointing out that a lot of leftists are self-righteous, but really their political convictions are motivated more than anything else by vanity. Today we would even call it virtue signaling. And there's some very funny material in his books that try to make this point. And again, they kind of cut if you are a leftist because he knew his stuff, right? He'd spent a lot of time in those circles, so he knew what he was talking about. Just one example of this would be in his great novel Devils, or Demons as it's sometimes translated, where there's a kind of proto-socialist, proto-anarchist cabal of middle-class intellectuals that meets in a small Russian town. They literally spend a couple of hours debating their pronouns, right? Do we refer to ourselves as sir or madam, or do we use our proper names, or do we use our new, radical names? And everyone gets really angry about this. And then a whole bunch of intellectuals stand up to talk about the importance of equality while making it very, very clear that they're trying to present themselves as intellectually superior, not just to everyone in their own circle, but to the Russian peasantry that they are purporting to try to save. And it's very funny stuff, right? And anybody who's seen the left at its worst, and I want to stress at its worst, will recognize some of the characteristics that you see there. I mean, I'm on the left, and I don't think anybody on the left would disagree with me if I said that sometimes we can get on each other's nerves, right? And we have a few bad habits. His main psychological critique is that the internalization of modern ideas about freedom, equality, and science in particular are inherently psychologically destabilizing. This probably comes through most clearly in his novel Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov tries to internalize certain ideas about utilitarianism and about the greater good to justify his murder of an old woman, because he says, look, she's nasty, she's not a particularly good person, everyone despises her, and she's old, I'm young, and if I take her money, then eventually, I'll use that to pursue the greater good, and everyone will be better off for that. But, on Dostoevsky's telling, what this eventually turns out to really be motivated by was this egocentric desire to kind of be a better person or bigger person, almost a kind of proto-Nietzschean will to power, where eventually Raskolnikov starts to think of himself as a Napoleon-type figure who's entitled to disobey certain Judeo-Christian norms about morality in order to pursue what he takes to be the greater good, but which is really just an expression of his own ego. And then I suppose the last criticism of the left that Dostoevsky makes is a philosophical criticism, which you find most developed in the Brothers Karamazov. And this philosophical criticism is deep and wide-ranging, but it's probably best expressed in The Tale of the Grand Inquisitor, which some of you may be familiar with, where Dostoevsky essentially suggests that, in a way that a lot of leftists would find very odd, socialism is really a kind of totalitarian Catholicism of all things, a desire to achieve a kind of orderly, managed society where all the base human needs are catered to through submission to authority in this world. And Dostoevsky sees this as perverse, since really a truly human life would be one where we don't create such a mechanical system to cater to human needs, but instead goodness is expressed through individual acts of grace and pity of the sort that you also see expressed in his novels. And of course, we know many conservatives who will make similar kinds of arguments as this, albeit in a much more crude form. Think about all the defenders of capitalism who will say things like, if we provide people with free healthcare, if we provide people with free schooling, then that will deny them the opportunity to be good through charity, right? We shouldn't do it like that. Dostoevsky is making a somewhat similar critique, albeit on a much more rarefied level. So this satirical, psychological, and philosophical critique of the left is, again, very powerful on Dostoevsky's part. Needs to be answered, and I try to develop part of an answer in this book. But I suggest that the best response is, again, to appeal to Tolstoy, who is familiar with Dostoevsky's work, who wrote an enormously important book called The Kingdom of God is Within You, that was inspirational for people like Gandhi or for Martin Luther King in the United States. And Tolstoy said, if you are really committed to these Judeo-Christian norms of the sort that so many conservatives claim to be committed to, how can you support something like a monarchy? Or how can you support something like war? Or how can you support a system where the rich lord it over the poor? Aren't we supposed to be committed as good Christians to this idea that the poor, the humble, the meek are the most beloved of God's children and are supposed to be the epicenter of our attention? How can conservatives sit there and support something like grand imperialist wars launched by the Tsarist regime against their brothers and sisters in Germany? Doesn't seem all that Christian, let alone all that humane to him. So that's putting it very crudely. Of course, Tolstoy is an enormously profound author, but these kinds of critiques of a kind of Dostoevskian national conservatism, I think, are very much on point. So I can talk about Nietzsche afterwards, who, as I mentioned, is the other gigantic apex, I would say, of right-wing thought. But I'll just pause and see if you wanted to say anything in response to that.
Well, there's a lot there. What I kind of understood was there are these critiques of the left, and there are these critiques of modernism, and it has a kind of corrupting influence, or Dostoevsky sees a kind of corrupting influence, and in a way, okay, he moves it to spirituality, so he moves it to, like, in a sense, you're moving it then to the individual, and if I understand correctly, then this kind of sets up Nietzsche. I'm sorry, because I'm kind of repeating what you said before. You said all that kind of brilliant kind of explanation you just gave. But I still want to kind of go back then to then Dostoevsky kind of sets up Nietzsche.
Yep.
To kind of put a wrecking ball through civilization, and then it makes me think of Steve Bannon. Because Steve Bannon literally said, I think, that he wanted to put a wrecking ball through liberalism. And Steve Bannon actually has called himself at points a Leninist. And I find that's really interesting, because then you think, what is he taking from Lenin? And in a sense, what he's taking is just the will to completely upend societal conditions. And then I think there's, that's where I think there can be a confusion over what is radicalism and what is revolutionary. And I think that is what has led people towards Trump often.
Oh, yes.
People who really see that change, and they see Trump as somehow destroying the conditions of liberal society in America. And in a way, you can kind of see, well, there's this kind of quite weak Enlightenment thinking, which is kind of Nietzsche's, Nietzsche talks about this praise of the weak as if because the strong are bad, the weak must be good. So Nietzsche talks about this in the genealogy of morality. So, there's this kind of very, very fluffy, woolly thinking that, please, can you just leave us alone and let us have a good life? And if you say that enough, then that's what's going to happen. And if you appeal to God, that's going to happen. But then if you want to get away from that, because that's just not really plausible, to rational thinkers, you then appeal to the elite. You appeal to the political elite, and you believe that, yes, they're going to give us the good things. And what Dostoevsky is kind of saying is that this is kind of a weak-willed way of thinking. But then Nietzsche comes in and he expands on this enormously, and he goes like full on. He goes full on kind of like, how could you call it? What gets interpreted as a kind of animalism. It's just like that we ought to just be grabbing everything that we feel to be rightfully ours. So this is kind of this is how his will to power gets interpreted. And well, that's kind of, I think, what we see in Trumpianism is it's like almost a can Trump do that on our behalf? Can Trump do the Nietzschean thing on our behalf and then redistribute everything to us? It's like somehow Nietzsche becomes communist and Trump is a Lenin of this Nietzschean communism. Excuse me, because now I'm aware that what I'm saying is kind of taking twists and turns. But isn't that kind of where you end up with Dugin? Because the Russian Dugin, because Dugin kind of is a postmodern right-wing thinker. So what he's therefore kind of doing is he's kind of a perpetual naysayer. He's kind of he's perpetually turning things on their head. There's no truth for Dugin, and that kind of no truth is the right wing's revolutionarism. How could you call it? It's the right wing's revolutionary movement. Does that make any sense at all?
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, I'll be slightly egotistical here and say that when I published, the Rise of Post-Modern Conservatism and What is Postmodern Conservatism with some other people back in 2018 and 2019, I kind of described this as an unconscious phenomena where people on the political right were internalizing the norms of postmodern culture and reflecting them in their political practices. Very much inspired by Fred Jameson, who I think is probably the most brilliant Marxist thinker alive right now. I had no idea that it had become so self-conscious in a way that you now see expressed, where people like Alexander Dugin will write in the Fourth Political Theory that he's deeply influenced by Deleuze and Foucault and their relativism and their critique of Western rationalism, or people for that matter like Chris Rufo, who some of your audience might be familiar with, where Rufo will say, we live in a postmodern moment. He uses that language. Where the right really needs to be inspired by Baudrillard and recognize that nobody is interested in reason anymore. What they're interested is in narrative and presentation. And so we on the little political right need to be strategic, not in how we argue, but in how we present information and how we control information, because that's what's going to win us the day. So I was wrong, in those books. Apparently it is a self-conscious movement now. There really are people who identify as postmodern conservatives or postmodern radical rightists unambiguously. But in terms of how this relates back to Nietzsche, I argue in the book that Nietzsche is the apex, the real apex of right-wing thought, right? Just a notch above Dostoevsky, because Dostoevsky was still too hesitant to go all the way in a critique of modernity and its roots in a way that Nietzsche has no fear in doing. Dostoevsky really wanted to save or preserve something of the spirit of Judeo-Christian civilization, and he wanted to do so sincerely. And you'll see that expressed even when in his more conservative moments. For instance, when he expresses a deep admiration for the Russian peasantry, an enormous amount of sympathy for their poverty, and admires people who are charitably or pitifully disposed towards them and trying to ameliorate the condition of the very poor. Nietzsche has none of that, right? What makes Nietzsche so remarkable is where earlier reactionary thinkers from de Maistre to Dostoevsky saw religion as a kind of bulwark against Enlightenment rationalism for many good reasons. Nietzsche says, no. Actually, there's something extremely arbitrary about assuming that Judeo-Christian civilization is going to be a kind of guardrail against, or Judeo-Christian values will be a guardrail against progressive and revolutionary movements, when it's Judeo-Christian civilization that gave birth to these revolutionary movements, right? One of the very few thinkers that intimated the same thing beforehand was Alexis de Tocqueville, who in Democracy in America said, if the left ever gets its hands on Christianity and really gets its hands on it, it's effectively going to be unstoppable, right? Because there's a very, very clear symmetry between these Christian demands that, the wretched of the earth will know that God is on their side and demanding an end to the aristocracy. So what Nietzsche does is say that at the root of these revolutionary movements is a very deep-seated commitment on the part of Western figures to equality that finds its initial expressions in the slave morality of Christianity. because Christianity fundamentally was this idea that the weak will inherit the earth, right? That the master morality that had been persistent for such a long time, that was comfortably aristocratic, was not just debased or not just problematic, but evil. And it needs to be overcome. And it needs to be overcome by the wretched of the earth, who will ascend to or create the kingdom of heaven. And what Nietzsche points out is that Christianity went through a lot of different mutations over time, but all of them eventually led to the emergence of things like liberalism, socialism, and democracy. Now, I don't have time to unpack all the different expressions of his commentary in this respect. I'll just foreground two elements of this. So in the genealogy of morals, he points out that many people, many religious people, are deeply wary of Enlightenment reason, and they see it as a threat to religion. Nietzsche says no. This will to truth that was characteristic of Christianity, and indeed the Platonic metaphysics that Christianity kind of inherited or took over, is ultimately what led to the destruction of Christian metaphysics, because this will to truth led Christian thinkers to ask inference after inference about how the world is, until, as he puts it in the genealogy of morals, they finally came to their most striking inference, the inference against themselves, and asked themselves whether their own metaphysics and their own commitment to truth was itself something that was true or grounded in truth. And this led to the secularization of the modern world, or at least it contributed a great deal to it, according to Nietzsche. But what's remarkable about this process of self-secularization that Christianity went through, according to Nietzsche, and this is his second main point, is that even though many people dropped Christian metaphysics, there was still this deep yearning, in fact, insistence upon retaining Christian morality, this idea of human equality before the throne of God, indeed, even elevating human equality to a new kind of idol. And his claim is that liberalism, democracy, and socialism especially are essentially offshoots of Christianity. His famous definition of socialism in The Will to Power is Christianity with a residue of Rousseau, right? Or, in The Twilight of the Idols, he says, liberalism is fundamentally an outlook that is appropriate for shopkeepers, women, cows, and Christians, of course, right? And Nietzsche's whole point is that there's some deep inconsistency here, right? Once you abandon Christian metaphysics, the way that many leftists insist that we must, you also have to drop Christian morality. We can't carry forward with it the way that so many of us want to. What you're thrust into once you abandon Christian metaphysics isn't a world where we regard everyone as equal, but a world where we recognize that some people are healthy and some people are unhealthy, some people are strong and some people are weak, and there's no point in trying to draw moral distinctions of any sort between these two kinds of categories, right? Now, that's putting it really crudely, right? Nietzsche's a really deep thinker, so there's a lot more different sides to this idea. We haven't even gotten to all that stuff about resentment, but we'll put that aside for now. How does he respond to all this? Well, this speaks to your point about a kind of revolutionary or radical right, which I argue really finds its highest theoretical expression in Nietzsche, because many people on the political left assume that the political right is inherently purely conservative, right? It's about trying to conserve things as they are, preserve things as they are. And this has meant that many people on the left struggle when conservatives or people on the right will demand radical social change. But Nietzsche's whole point is, look, the Judeo-Christian civilization that so many people on the right are committed to is what has brought us liberalism, socialism, and democracy. So what we need is radical change. We need to upend this entire civilization and 2,000 years of culture if we're going to restore or establish the right kind of society. And the right kind of society, according to Nietzsche, is one that is going to be radically hierarchical, right? Far more hierarchical even than what you would see in the Greek world, what he sometimes calls, or what Georgia Brandes called, a kind of aristocratic radicalism, in a letter to Nietzsche, which Nietzsche said was very clever and a good description of his views. And aristocratic radicalism, according to Nietzsche, is the only kind of society that can appropriately create the conditions for a non-nihilistic culture, by allowing the best and most vital members of the human species, those who are most approximate to God, or to being gods, to engage in the kinds of projects that will bring a kind of energy and health to life. And Nietzsche is very, very clear that these kinds of aristocratic radicals will be highly amoral in many senses. In fact, he points out in Beyond Good and Evil that slavery will absolutely be necessary in order to provide the material base or the mode of production, if you want, for the pursuit of the great projects that aristocratic radicals will be committed to. And he is very critical even of conservatives like Otto von Bismarck. In a famous passage on the labor question, he says that Otto von Bismarck and German conservatives are way too soft on the labor question because they've educated workers, they've given workers something like a political party, or permitted something like a political party for workers in the form of the SPD. And he says this is ridiculous, right? What we should be training the workers to do is to accept their lot and to become, as he characterizes it in a very racist way, a kind of Chinaman. And he says, why shouldn't we do this, right? We want the workers to be, and I quote, slaves. We don't want them to be politically active citizens. So why not educate them to be slaves? That's supposed to be their lot in life. And the problem, according to Nietzsche, was that 19th century German conservatives were just too soft to recognize this and to really instantiate the program that would be necessary to restore the culture through a commitment to aristocratic radicalism. Now, of course, Nietzsche has many progeny that take up different aspects of this project. We won't be able to get into nearly all of them now, but one quick example would be the German conservative revolutionaries, people like, say, Martin Heidegger or Carl Schmitt, or, in Italy and Italian fascism, Julius Evola, all of whom were committed to a rejection of Das Mann, the reign of the mediocre, or, the kind of soft Christians, as Evola liked to call them. And in the United States right now, there are plenty of people who are taking up Nietzsche's project, albeit in their own way. And usually this takes the form on the part of people like BAP or Richard Hanania of arguing that we need to recommit ourselves to a kind of hyper-capitalism or even a libertarian capitalism. So, for instance, BAP recently supported Milei's election in Argentina. And Hanania, of course, has been very insistent about getting rid of the welfare state. And some people have said that's odd, right? How can these disciples of Nietzsche suddenly be pro-capitalist, since wasn't Nietzsche anti-capitalist? But they're very overt about the fact that, look, our Nietzscheanism isn't necessarily a kind of apostle like Nietzscheanism. What we're committed to is this project of restoring the proper hierarchy or a hierarchy to society and allowing a kind of more muscular capitalism with the gloves off. We'll do that by filtering out the weak and allowing the strong to rise without any of these kinds of namby-pamby, effeminate welfare state kind of protections. That
I think that's very pragmatic at the moment, because
absolutely
the West just can't compete with the East, with China particularly. So, how are they going to survive other than by further subjugating the public? I don't know how AI will play into this, though. That's a whole different issue. But it appears that the elite kind of also dealing with climate change. They see what's coming, and they're going to have to deal with a very angry, disaffected mass, and the only way they're going to be able to contain that is by getting the mass firmly under their thumb. They're doing that by offering the mass everything, pointing to communists as the enemy, when the communists normally are actually liberals anyway, that they're calling communists, scapegoating immigrants, etc. Then offering like the core in America, well, I would say the core white working class, but it's not just the white working class, but the core working class, offering them the world, making out as if they're going to turn each and every one of them into a kind of Nietzschean Superman, but actually turning them all into slaves. And this is a real problem.
Well, yeah, and I should say,
obviously,
even in the United Kingdom, you're probably familiar with Douglas Murray. He had the I'm not afraid to be white variety. In his recent book on the West, Murray also directly appeals to Nietzsche and says, look, all these demands for a welfare state, for feminism, for trans inclusivity, they're expressions of Nietzschean ressentiment, right? In the sense that it is the lower orders and the losers in society saying that what they want is justice, but really wanting to take their betters down a peg. We shouldn't have any of that. So these ideas are very, very popular on the political right, on both sides of the Atlantic, right? Although in Some cases they're combined with nationalism, and some cases combined with support for capitalism. Really eclectic combinations of the sort that Nietzsche probably would not himself admire, since he was against parasitic readings of his work or any work. But he's dead now, so it's not like he can do anything to stop these people from taking up his work in whatever ways they think are necessary in order to support the really disgusting views of society that they want to propagate.
Yeah, I mean, well, we don't have a lot of time, so I think we're going to have to bring it into some kind of course of action. I suppose in terms of a course of action of what can we do about this, I don't know. But you have described very well the problem. And I think Nietzsche is kind of key here, and your description of Dostoevsky in the book is brilliant. And then you're ending on Dugin and which we can't really get into, but certainly the we can say the risks of the postmodern right. There are big risks of a kind of post-truth right, which we kind of already know on the left. But linking that to Nietzsche, I think it just highlights how dangerous this is, because for example, in the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche's example is, I believe it's an eagle and a lamb, but I've seen people use different animals. But he basically says, well, the fact that the eagle is kind of bad in the scenario where the eagle grabs and kills a lamb doesn't make the lamb good, and you see it for what it is. Given that scenario, it's like, well, yeah, of course, the eagle, the lamb is just weak. And if you have a right-wing political movement which basically follows that logic, then you have complete license to treat the weak in any way that's conducive to them furthering their own power aims. And you see this in Gaza now, which if this kind of immunizes us against the kind of horrors we're seeing coming from Gaza, that's really obviously dangerous. I don't have to say even that that's dangerous. I mean, it's really frightening, because that can just be repeated, in different scenarios, across the world. So yeah, we're in a really crappy situation, but I don't suppose we can solve it politically. What are you going to do next as a writer? I suppose that's the only thing we can really end on. What's your next project, and how are you addressing this next?
Oh, sure. So just very briefly, right? I think there are two things that we can do, right? I'll start by talking in general terms, and then I'll move on to my specific writings. In general terms, the one thing that I do take away from the right that I think is correct, or one of the things that I take away from the right is I think is correct, is that it is important to stop ascribing a kind of inherent moral virtue to the dispossessed or the suffering in the world. And the best left-wing thinkers never did this, right? It's not like you read Marx and he'll say that the reason why the working class should triumph is because people in the working class are just morally better than people in the ruling class or the capitalists, right? He insists that these are social categories and there's specific reasons why the working class is going to be the vehicle for emancipation, but none of that has to do with any kind of moralistic claptrap, as he probably would have called it, right? And I think this is just commonsensical, right? Anybody who spent any real time in the world will know that there's some very nice rich people out there, and there's some very shitty working class people out there. There's also some extraordinary working class people out there who will work day in and day out to try to bring a better world. And then there's plenty of Elon Musks in the world, right? So things are too complicated to rely on these very simplistic moralistic boundaries between victim and oppressor, right? And I think that there's been some pushback against that recently, and it's healthy. In terms of what I'm working on right now, I'm going to be handing in a book called The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism at the end of the month. It's being introduced by my wife, who's a wonderful person and a great political theorist, and very excited for that. And my argument in this book is that liberal socialism is the way forward, because I think that what we need right now is socialist agitation for economic democracy and economic equality, but that needs to be immunized against any temptations towards authoritarianism by taking seriously the more insightful lessons of the left liberal tradition. We don't have time to go into the big thesis of that right now, but for those who are probably skeptical, and I imagine quite a few of you are, I try to respond very respectfully to some left-wing critics like the Marxist tradition who might be wary of this, since I also think, of course, that liberal socialists have an enormous amount to learn from them, and I try to take that seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I've had struggles with the kind of, apologists for Sovietism, apologists for Stalinism. You've seen some of these struggles in our private circles in Facebook chats and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly a Soviet Marxist, or I don't really use the term communist. I'm all for a kind of you know, an engagement with liberal socialism, democratic socialism, social democracy, anything which can avoid, you know, the horrors we otherwise see on the left and right. So yeah, I look forward to that. Well, yeah, you're among people who aren't going to like nail you to the wall for discussing liberal socialism anyway.
Well, I'd be surprised. I mean, there's some Marxist circles that I'm part of where, you know, I mean, I'm sure you've encountered them. They're like, well, the reactionaries are bad, but the liberals are worse. And once we get rid of them, then we'll move on to the reactionaries. And my response is constantly, I'm like, oh, I don't know, man. If you've actually looked at some of what these reactionaries are calling for, where they're like, we need to restore a slave society, I'd say that they are worse. You know?
Yeah.
I don't think you spend any real time with reactionaries, then.
Yeah, don't. I don't recommend it.
I think. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to displace the notion that change only comes through violence. But, you know, once you descend to that, then once you descend to that, you're going to have the violence for sure, you know. Whereas if you try and make the changes without the violence, well, maybe you will have changes, you know, without the violence. So, you know, it's a difficult argument. You know, I struggle a lot because, you know, evidently, you know, you could go, well, there wasn't really violence behind the British creation of the welfare state post World War II. Well, it was called World War II. You know, that was the violence. So it's a tricky one, but for another time though, because we can't go deep into that. But you want to leave us with one thought, Matt, for the listeners?
Sure. Once upon a time, not so long ago, or maybe I'm just getting old, so maybe it was a long time ago. Many people on the the left didn't really take right-wing thinking seriously, saw it really beneath consideration, or just weren't interested in engaging with it. I think that was a serious mistake. I think in the parlance of the day, we need to know our enemy and ideally know him better than he knows himself. And I would like to see my book as a small contribution to that. And I'm happy to say that more of us are taking this task seriously, right? Not just reading the trash conservative intellectuals, which is useful, but seriously looking into the reactionary and right-wing tradition. People like Corey Robin and Wendy Brown are well-established examples. But you can also see people like Nathan Robinson, our good friend Ben Burgess, Paul Johnson, got a good friend of mine, doing fantastic work in that field. Or Larry Allen Buss, great Marxist critic of Hayek, has a book, The Right-Wing Mirror, Critical Theory, coming out soon. So I'm really optimistic about the future of left critics of the right. I think we're getting more and more sophisticated over time. And we've talked about some dark stuff in our chat today, but that gives me a little bit of hope.
Thank you. Yeah, there is that contradiction with talking about the dark stuff. That means that, well, at least we're still present and critical, and maybe we can change things then. Okay, thanks a lot, Matt. Please follow Matt's work. We'll put all his details in the description to the podcast and the YouTube version. And great, see you listeners next time, and we'll be talking to Matt again, no doubt, in the future.
Cool. Left is
Thank
best.
you.